Good morning friends and welcome back to NPTEL online certification course on public speaking. Friends, you might remember well that in the previous lecture we had an introductory discussion on speeches. We also talked about the various patterns of speeches and we could see how different occasions demand different patterns. Now, in this lecture, we are going to talk about the types of speeches, because as a speaker, you will get different occasions to speak on, right from your professional world, even in some of your informal circles also, at times you are required to give speeches. So, this lecture will actually be around various types of speeches which are required in our everyday formal situations. Now, when we talk about the type of speeches, we can categorize or classify speeches into 4 categories: informative, demonstrative, persuasive and entertaining. We have already been discussing even in previous lectures that all sorts of talks are persuasive in nature, and when it comes to speeches, of course the talks have to be persuasive. You also are familiar with the various ways how to make your speech persuasive or your talk persuasive, but here our main focus will be on creating or orienting you towards informative speeches. And in informative speeches, we will also talk about its subcategories. Now, you might be thinking, my dear friend, as to what can be an informative speech. As the name itself suggests that an informative speech will be having information. Now, if it is based simply on information, where lies the role of the speaker? So, in an informative speech, the speaker's role is just to inform. Speech springs out of our everyday living with the purpose to inform, and that you have been doing either as a student also when you are supposed to give a short presentation in a class, then you are going to inform them. As a teacher also you are going to inform them. As an employer you are going to inform them. Whatever be the topic, everyone has to perform the act of informing. So, the aim of informational public speaking or informational speech is to convey knowledge and understanding. You might have at times found that the senior manager of an organization or the CEO of the organization giving a speech to the newly recruited junior managers. Now, what the speaker does there? He will actually inform them about the work culture of his organization. It is based on his experience. It is also based upon the way things take place or things move in his organization. But such a sort of speech cannot have the sort of persuasive technique. It is not used for advocating any cause. Rather, it is always informative in nature. It has a lot of information. Now, this information can be of different sorts. We will see in the further slides that when we talk about an informative speech, what could be the criteria? So, for any informative speech, because you actually want the listeners to get some pieces of information which could be very useful for them. And that is why Lucas, in his seminal text entitled The Art of Public Speaking, actually mentions three major components, three major attributes of an informational speech. The very first is accuracy. Whatever piece of information you are going to provide your listeners with, they ought to be very accurate, because this information is going to help them in the days to come. Then, even if information is accurate, but it is actually clothed in such a way that the listeners are not able to understand, the purpose will be defeated, my dear friend. That is why the information should not only be accurate, the information also has to be clear, very transparent. Every word that you speak, every policy, every affair that you talk about has to be very clear. And then you must also see that you continue to interest the listeners. I mean, how you can keep your listeners engaged? Do your pieces of information cater to the needs of these people? That is what are required in an informational speech. Now, we shall see what could be the types of informational speeches. Informational speeches can be divided into four categories. They are about objects, about process, about events, about concepts. Imagine yourself being in an organization. So, at times when you have joined as a new employee, you will actually be provided with some amount of training, and that may also be a part of the speech. Some of your senior bosses, some of your CEOs, some of the unit heads will tell you about certain objects. At times they may also tell you about some processes. At times they may also tell you about some events so that you can take a lesson or a cue out of it. At times they may also tell about some concepts. But the same thing you can also do when you climb the ladders up and you are in a position where you are going to drive these things home, and that actually are going to help them, that actually are going to make their task easier. So, how can it be? When we talk about objects, especially about objects, you will find that speech about objects, they are actually around something which are tangible, which are visible, and which are stable. So, when we talk about speeches about objects, so the focus should be on anything that is tangible, anything that is visible, anything that is stable in form. Now, you might be thinking that what could be the topics of such speeches? These speeches can range from people to place to animals to structure, anything it could be. Now, say for example, if you are going to draft a speech, especially this speech which is about object, now how will you do that? Say for example, first you will talk about, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, first we will talk about the specific purpose. What is the specific purpose? The specific purpose is to inform the audience about a person, about a place, about some object, about some animals. Then will come central idea where you will develop, I mean the core idea of the speech, and then will come the main points. Here you can have a look at how a speech on a very important person can be crafted. And you must remember, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, that your speech should begin in such a way that it is captivating. Let us look at the beginning lines of this speech. Suppose a college going student or a school going student is to deliver a talk on Mahatma Gandhi. Now, how can he begin? Who has not heard the name of Mahatma Gandhi? An apostle of peace and non-violence. A lawyer by profession and a politician, Gandhiji is revered not only in India but all around the world for his principles of truth, peace and non-violence. As a freedom fighter, he led movements like Salt March, Non-Cooperation, Quit India, etc. Instrumental in freedom struggle, Gandhi led A Simple Life, and as a social reformer, he fought not only for India's freedom but also raised his voice against several social evils like untouchability and child marriage. Now you might have found how easy it is when you are going to talk about a person. The same sort of ease you can find if you follow these guidelines, and when you are going to write or draft a speech on structure, a place or animals. So, but then you have actually to fix the specific purpose. And what are these specific purposes? The specific purpose is the fundamental features of the chosen subject. We have, as you saw in the previous one, while we were talking about Gandhi, we talked about his accomplishments. One may organize the speech either in a spatial order. Suppose we are talking about a structure. So, the specific purpose will be to inform the audience about the design of the Taj Mahal, and the central idea will be how you will tell them about the central idea. The Taj Mahal is divided into 5 sections, each with its own attractions. You will find, my dear friend, it is actually drafted in such a manner, and then it provides you a sort of sequence, and then you will come to the main points, and the main points will be the attributes, because here you have talked about own attractions. So naturally you will talk about the moonlight garden situated north of the river Yamuna, then the riverfront terrace consisting of the mausoleum, mosque and guest house. Then you will talk about Charva garden, then you will talk about Naubat Khana divided into 2 parts, and then you will also talk about Jila Khana consisting of accommodational facilities for tomb attendants. So this is how you are going to create a sort of sequence of your speech when you are going to talk about a structure. Likewise, you can also craft many other such speeches on animals. You can also talk about certain objects also. Then another category of informational speech is talking about process. As you all know, my dear friend, process is that when you are telling others how one is going to make something new. What is a process? You all know that a process actually entails a series of actions that one can take when one is going to explain something new, how something can be done, how something works, as Lucas says. So, when we talk about the process, there can be 2 aims. The first is to make the listeners understand the steps, because you are talking about the process. So, if one step you leave, naturally the process will not be complete. You have already talked about how communication also is a process, right from sender to the message to the medium to the receiver and finally to the feedback. Like that, when you are going to talk about the process, you are actually going to make your listeners understand the various steps and their relations to each other better. In such a speech, your specific purpose is to inform the audience about, say for example, if you are going to talk about a process of growing trees or plants in hilly regions. Now, what could be the other points? The other points could be about climatic conditions, soil type. While doing that, please see that you do not instruct them to grow the plants themselves. Actually, you are telling them about the process. Fine. So, you will simply tell them about these steps. Naturally, after your speech is complete, they will actually take a sort of inspiration from your speech, and next time they can, because your main purpose is simply to inform, not to inspire. Another aim of an informative speech is, especially about process, to enable listeners to perform the process themselves. Fine. How? How can it be? Say for example, somebody wants to make a new dish, or a speaker is going to tell them about a new recipe, or somebody is going to talk about, say, gardening, fine, how you are going to orient the audience with the skill. So you can begin your talk on gardening with a catchy phrase. I think you might all be by this time prepared how you can write the first sentence of your speech. Now here you can have a look at how I have tried to craft a speech on gardening. Again, as I said in the previous lecture, you can shock the audience or you can say something which may make them curious. Have you ever thought of how one can make one's idle hours enjoyable, experiential and enriching? If you allow me, I can tell you of one such hobby that you all are aware of yet tend to remain unaware. Simple, very simple. It is gardening, dear friends. Gardening grows the spirit, makes you bubble every day, and after a few months, the blooms that appear on plants provides you with a sense of achievement. Don't you find it interesting the way the speech moves on? And then you will talk about how gardening can take place, how there are other steps involved in it. And finally, towards the end, because as I have said, that you should actually try to make your speech memorable. So towards the end, you may, when you are going to wind up, you may say, gardening is a work of the heart. It is not only a work of the hand, it is a work of the heart. So if you craft, draft, compose your speech on process like this, I think the speech is going to be very attractive for your audience members. Next is speech about events that are also informative. Now, all of us are familiar with events. When something happens, that is called an event. And I mean, there are so many events which have become a part of our tradition, of our culture. Sometimes you also remember some event and then you are going to share it with your friends, and that you are trying to craft it into the form of a speech. So any event can be approached from any angle or combination of angles, features, origins, implications, benefits, and so on and so forth. Here you can find on the right hand side how a person is going to talk about events. And such a sort of talk, such a sort of speech should be analytical, and it should follow which order? Topical order. Then only your audience members will remember. You might all be curious enough to know what could be the topic of such an event. The topics can be numerous, my dear friend, right from earthquakes, right from, say, Independence Day. At times you can talk about, that is also an event which most of us remember. Sometimes you can also talk about sleep disorders. Sometimes you can also talk about the casting of the Ramayana on the Mahabharata or the Mahabharata on the television. You can talk about job interviews. You can also talk about the use of cell phones, and you know well how you can begin. Because the way you begin, say for example, when you are going to talk about job interviews, and if you start your speech like, one event that all of us are going to face in the days to come, can you really make a guess? I think this is interview which most of us come across. And when it comes to getting a job, I think it becomes mandatory to know what is a job interview and how to participate and perform in a job interview. Now, there can be another category, that is speech about concepts. That is also informative in nature. Now, this can be very abstract because this hinges on ideas, principles, theories, and many more. Such a sort of speech or subtype of informational speech is different from objects, processes, or events. Here, the knowledge that you are going to share with is going to be very complex. Fine? It is not about information simply, but it is also about authenticity, my dear friend. So, while delivering a speech about concepts, one must have to do a lot of research, my dear friend, before you come to deliver the talk. So, in such a sort of speech, the topics could be like transcendentalism, existentialism, film theory, film studies, conflict management, time management, Aristotelian tragedy, dreams. All these can be the topics of such speeches. Now, when you are going to describe such a speeches, what you are supposed to do is you need to define the concepts. You can also make use of examples. You can also make use of comparisons. You can also talk of critics. But for that, you need to get yourself armed with a lot of knowledge. You need to have researched a lot. But remember, you need to avoid using technical knowledge, because if you are going to talk about something and in a very technical way, maybe you are going to lose half of the crowd. That is why in the beginning I have said it is better if we can make use, or if you can mix old with the new. But when we are talking about a concept and also in the form of a speech, we first need to be clear of what we are going to say. Whatever we are going to say should be supported by evidence, because among the crowd also many people might be familiar with this. What new you are going to share with them, that actually is very important, my dear friend. Now, having discussed all these subtypes of informative speeches, it is time now that we should find out what could be the guidelines. The first is that ideas should be personalized. One should always relate the subject of the speech directly with the audience. One should avoid the uses of technical language, as we have said, and one should never overestimate himself as a speaker and underestimate listeners as the members of the audience. One also needs to stay away from various abstractions, because that may create a sort of confusion. Now, you might also be thinking that if there could be speeches of concepts, of events, should there not be speeches to entertain also? Yes, my dear friends, there are speeches to entertain also. There are many small events that we need to celebrate, or we need to share with many of our near and dear ones, and sometimes such speeches could be entertaining in nature, even though it may appear to be very easy. But my dear friends, it is always said, to make a person cry is not as difficult as to make a person laugh. So, to create a sort of entertainment is very difficult. Such speeches have the fundamental purpose of capturing the audience's attention with some sort of amusement. Speakers, when they are to deliver some entertaining speeches, naturally the topics differ, right from birthday celebrations to weddings, sometimes to open mic sessions, sometimes to many other events also. So, now there are some elements which are very important for the speeches of entertainment. That is, as I said, it is very difficult to make people laugh or amuse. So, what are important? Preparation, adaptation to the audience. I mean, you may try your level best to make them laugh, but it's very difficult. So, see to it that there should be some relevance as to what you are going to say and how it is going to amuse them. Adaptation to the occasion. Naturally, if the event is of a birthday or a wedding, you should not go for words which are very heavy and words which do not suit the occasion. And of course, such speeches are shorter in nature. So one should also remember the time part or the time quotient. Now, as I have been saying, that persuasion is the mantra in all sorts of speeches, and we have already discussed and mentioned previously that there could be one category of speech which we can call speeches of persuasion. So there can be one type of speech which is meant for persuasion. So we have already discussed these two, meaning thereby informational, and in informational we have talked about some processes, events and all, and entertaining also. But at the same time, when you are going for a persuasive speech, you actually should be adept at the process of creating, reinforcing or changing people's beliefs or actions. It's very difficult, my dear friend. To convert an audience into a sort of buyer to your ideas is a very difficult task. So you might have often found, especially in law courts, the way advocates make use of their own alibis or their own logical arguments, they are persuasive in nature. So career aspirations like lawyers, even salespeople also do that, how they try to win you. Then in many organizations, public relations officers, if you ever get a time to talk to them, and then they actually can do this. How? By conquering the mind of the other people. So you must have that ability to conquer. Persuasion is not only equipping others with the power of words, but also making them aware of what to believe and what not to believe. That's very important in a persuasive speech. Now, the last category of speech that needs to be mentioned is a demonstrative speech. Let us go to the word demonstration. So when, imagine, sometimes you are to buy a policy and you can find the skills that an LIC agent uses. No, he or she actually tries to win you, but how? They actually demonstrate a new policy, a new thing that has come to the market, especially when at times they also make campaigns. Nowadays we are living in an age of Android phones. So every new phone that comes, so for that you can find that there are several campaigns organized and the piece is demonstrated, and the people who are trying to win you, they will not only show you, but they will actually talk about the various attributes. So the audience members, they receive a lot of information on how to do something during this speech. So they also come to know because they are going to tell you. So it can also look like a sort of informational demonstrative speech where the effective information the speaker strongly supports. He will actually tell you that, you know, if you go for this and if you ask me what is actually the advantage of this cell phone, I can tell you, my dear friends, that nowadays the problem with most of us is that our batteries run short off when we are in a journey, and this phone has got a facility that its battery can run for 2 days. Once charged, it can actually enable you to be with you for at least 2 days. Now, what are these? These are actually some of the techniques that they make during their demonstrative speech. It is also an effective technique for pitching an idea and selling any product or story to potential buyer. It can be for a magazine, it can be for a movie, it can be for a web series, it can be for a phone, it can be for a policy, it can be for a new software, it can be for anything that is new, and for that the speakers who are going to demonstrate, they are demonstrating it. I mean, there has to be some fact in it, otherwise you are not going to convert the people into the buyers. Now, here let us see, I was thinking of a new airlines, how they could demonstrate, how they could play upon your mind. Most of you often wish if you could have wings, you could have flown to different parts, climbing high mountains, crossing vast seas and oceans, and enjoyed the freedom of experiencing the delights in no time. Imaginary though it may appear to many, but you must believe that with the wings of Bliss Airlines, your wishes can come true. We lend you wings and make you fly to your desired destinations. Now you see how in a very subtle manner the speaker has played on the imaginative aspects of your mind, and then now he will tell you what actually are the facilities, what are the advantages, what actually are the new things being offered by this Bliss airline. So it is actually a sort of demonstrative speech. Maybe they will also say, Mr. X, who first traveled with our airlines, can himself tell you how enjoying and enriching it was. So these are some of the techniques that can be utilized. But remember that while doing so, one also have to be very conscious of the questions of fact. Any assertion that meets truth or false is through questioning. People may ask you questions when you are giving such speeches. So the question related to facts can have absolute and conclusive answers. So during such a sort of speech, inconclusive issues do not have black and white answers. Now, how to analyze? When we take into account the questions of facts, naturally persuasive speech overlaps informative speech, though both are actually based on situation. So in an informative speech, I am trying to tell you the difference between informative and then demonstrative. So the speaker acts as a teacher or preacher, whereas in a persuasive speech, the speaker actually advocates his point of view with the main aim to persuade alone. Now, at times you can find that when you are talking about the facts or when you are having an analysis of questions of value, any statement that you provide can be more persuasive if it actually adds to the value. If you have been able to evoke the value, for example, if somebody reads the newspapers, one cannot simply say, imagine we are going to promote a new newspaper. So somebody who is trying to create a desire in others to read newspapers, if one says, I love reading the newspaper, that is actually a very general statement. Rather, what should be said is, one should always say rather, newspapers have been a rich source of information for a long time now. Now see, this statement is completely different. Here you find this single mention of the word, rich source of information, that actually adds feathers to this speech, and that is why it is important. Now there can be another categories of speeches also, say for example speeches on questions of policy. So when there is a speech on questions of policy, what should be kept into consideration? How my speech can gain passive agreement and how it can also help me gain an immediate attention. Now when we are talking about certain policies, one also needs to be aware of certain factors, meaning thereby need, plan, practicality. So what are these? You must create in them a sort of need, and once acknowledge the problem, you should actually provide them the solution included in that policy or in that object, and then you should also try to ensure that it is not only based on principles, but it also agrees to the practicality. This should actually not consist of words alone, rather it should have a sort of proper demonstration, and it should be demonstrated by facts. Now when you are going to organize speeches on questions of policy, these three, you can follow these three orders. We have already discussed them in one of the previous lectures, so there is no need to repeat it. Whereas we can simply say in the first order, it is a way to organize persuasive speech. In the second, one needs to identify the problem and then provide the solution. Fine. After identification, you will talk about the cause and then we will come to the solution. And the third one, where we talk about the comparative advantages order. Now, my dear friend, having said that, having discussed a lot about how one can create speeches for different occasions, how speeches and their content can be different, they are actually based upon the exigency of the situation. But as a speaker who is going to deliver his or her talk, one should always be careful that one has made a lot of homework while crafting, drafting, and finally preparing the speech. I think now you might be in a better condition to prepare your speech. But before I conclude this talk, my dear friend, let me make a mention of a beautiful quote by one of the contemporary famous authors named Ayn Rand, fine, whose first name was and is Ellis O'Connor, a Russian-born American writer, who says, "No speech is ever considered, but only the speaker. It is so much easier to pass judgment to a man than to an idea." What is actually the reflection? The reflection is that as a speaker you are more important, because your task is to convert the man into a buyer, to convert the man into one who can take action. Fine? And that is why what Ayn Rand says is, it is so much easier to pass judgment. Speaking is very easy, but speaking is very easy to pass judgment on a man than to an idea. So if you can change the idea, I think you have been successful as a speaker. So once again, let me repeat, no speech is ever considered but only the speaker. It is so much easier to pass judgments on a man than on an idea. So I hope you might be in a better condition, and the next time when you are going to deliver a talk, I think you will be in a better position and you will craft your speech in a better manner. With this, we come to the end of this lecture, and in the next lecture, we shall be talking about some special occasion speeches. Thank you very much.